pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, pawn to g6, king to g1, bishop to g7, pawn to c3, pawn to e5, pawn to d4, pawn to d4, pawn to d4, pawn to d4, bishop to f4, pawn to a6, bishop to a4, knight to e7, bishop to d6, pawn to b5, bishop to b3, bishop to b7, rook to e1, knight to c8, pawn to e5, knight to d6, pawn to d6, king to f8, pawn to h4, bishop to f6, knight to d2, king to g7, bishop to d5, knight to a5, bishop to b7, knight to b7, knight to e4, rook to e8, pawn to h5, rook to c8, rook to c1, rook to c1, queen to c1, pawn to h6, pawn to g6, pawn to g6, queen to d2, pawn to d3, pawn to b4, rook to e6, queen to d3, queen to b6, rook to d1, queen to c6, knight to f6, rook to f6, knight to e5, queen to c8, queen to d5, rook to e6, knight to g4, king to h7, queen to d4, queen to f8, queen to a7, rook to d6, rook to e1, knight to d8, knight to e5, queen to e7, knight to f3, rook to e6, rook to d1, rook to d6, rook to e1, rook to e6, rook to d1, rook to d6,